Hello, everyone. It's just a delight to be here with you at the WISE Summit, and we have a session now with Tatiana and Rachel from Systems Sanctuary, and it's about shifting systems through scaling deep. Just before we begin, I want to do a land acknowledgement. At Ashoka Canada, we've placed a high priority on supporting the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This commission was set up to discover and reveal past wrongdoings by government and others against Indigenous people and communities in the hope of repairing harm and resolving conflict. So in keeping with that, one of our traditions as a team is to begin all gatherings with acknowledgement and appreciation for the land. And while we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land, and from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people. So as you're joining, I'd invite everyone to introduce yourselves, who you are, where you're calling in from, and if you'd like to drop a comment about your experience or understanding of scaling deep, that would be helpful for us. So I'm so pleased to be here with Tatiana and Rachel. I'll give you a very brief introduction to them, and I'm going to drop the link for their organization into the chat. Rachel co-founded the Finance Innovation Lab and the Systems Studio in London, UK. And Tatiana co-founded the Girls Action Foundation, the Meta Lab, and co-authored the book Girl Positive. So they're here as co-conspirators with us and all of you around this really important topic of scaling deep. So here's what we're going to do for the next 45 minutes. I'm going to set up just a couple of minutes around context, what we're talking about here, why it's important. Then Tatiana and Rachel are going to present the findings from a 3-year action research project about scaling deep and help us understand what it is, how it works, what strategies it employs. We'll do a few minutes on clarifying questions, and then we'll have a discussion. And we're thinking about what resonates with you, where you have and have not seen scaling deep validated and appreciated. And then let's close with a discussion of what we think is needed to move this work forward. So our ultimate and not so secret goal here is to shift power. And we want to shift power from traditionally Western and dominant culture frameworks. It can be understood as scaling out, more, bigger, better, can be traditionally male ways of understanding change and success, to include feminist and more marginalized approaches around scaling deep. And by this, we mean the very, very hard work of shifting culture and mindset at the deep root level. So we're nicely positioned here within the WISE Summit, because at WISE we are working in the ecosystem of social change, and we're working hard to expand the definition of success. In Canada, we've observed this scaling deep approach often in the work of Indigenous people, and particularly women. And so it's critically important for us here that this work becomes recognized, celebrated, validated, and resourced. So Tatiana is an Ashoka Fellow, and this work was in fact the reason for her election and has been at the root of her inquiry ever since. And of course, we're not alone in this work. Scaling deep has been explored by others. I'm going to drop some links to other resources as we go through the session. We want to hold up and validate the work of others as we have this important conversation. So Tatiana and Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you to walk you through our research findings. Participants, please post questions in the chat, and we will pause as we need to address questions. Anything else we need, Tatiana and Rachel, before you dive in?
I think that is perfect. Thank you very much, Barb. It's great to be here with you.
Okay, great.
And Rachel, maybe you just want to say a quick hello before we dive in.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm Rachel, and I'm joining you from St. Louis in Missouri. We're on Osage territory, and it's really a delight to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks. And I'm Tatiana, and I'm coming in from Montreal, which is the traditional territory of the Kahnawake people. So it's wonderful to just have this opportunity to share the work that we've done around scaling deep, and in the context of WISER and the framing deep as a way to redefine success and think about change theory is really, really exciting. So what we're going to do, I'm going to just share how we came to a framework that helps us think about scaling deep in the context of systems change. So Rachel and I both together co-founded the System Sanctuary, which is where we do most of our work. We host and convene and facilitate peer learning cohorts for systems leaders. So we spend most of our time teaching, facilitating, and supporting systems leaders. And so we come at this work from a systems change approach. And the context, so as Barb mentioned, we spent 3 years in an action research project. And through this project emerged a kind of a new framework to think about scaling deep as systems change. And I'll tell you a little bit about that initiative. It was based in Canada, and it was supported by what was Status of Women Canada, which is the federal government that is in charge of women and gender equality. And they had funded basically about 8 initiatives that were collaborations across the country at different scales. So some at local scales, regional and national scales, to do systems change work on 3 issue areas. One was access to housing, one was access to economic security, and access to justice around gender-based violence. So there were 3 kind of interconnected issue areas and 8 initiatives across the country that were funded. And what we did is followed and worked with these initiatives to support their systems change strategy and to also do strategic learning as we went. And it was through this 3-year initiative that we emerged this new framework that we're going to share with you. So we came to this work then from a systems approach, a systems lens. We were looking at how are gender equity organizations doing systems change work. That was our question. And what are we learning about that? And we were working with collaboratives that were cross-sectoral, but that had a gender focus. And we're working to shift, as I said, multiple kind of systems that were related to housing, sexual violence, and economic security. So that's the context of the work. I'm just going to share my screen with you to walk through the framework. So just give me 1 second to make sure I can, oops, that's not it. I'm looking for the share screen. Here we go. There. So we'll just put this into present mode. Great. So in this work, you can see there are a number of organizations that we were working with to do this reflection and strategic learning around gender and systems change. And one of the most exciting things that we found is related to how we shift power and how we shift power through scaling deep as a way to do systems change work. And so when we think about scaling deep and we think about systems change, one of the key aspects and the key learning that we took away is that by using a scaling deep approach, it's a really critical strategic effort in shifting power. So when we, first of all, just to kind of set up scaling deep, I want to just share with you some of the frameworks that are kind of established around scale. So traditionally, when we think about scaling, we think about scaling up, which is around impacting laws and policy. So that's where a lot of the systems change work would assume to be happening.
Tatiana,
Yes?
we're not seeing the slides. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no. Okay. Thanks for sharing that.
I'm wondering, let's think about, just one sec, everyone. Let's see.
Can you see now?
Oh, yes. Awesome.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay, here we go. If we missed anything, Tatiana, take us back quick.
Okay, well, we'll continue here. Can you see? It's okay, you can see now? Can you see? Yeah, okay, I'm assuming yes. Okay, so in this slide, what we see is a framework around scale. And so typically when we think about scale, we talk about scaling up as a way to do systems change work. So this is where change happens around kind of policy level, around laws, it's changing institution and rules. And that's where a lot of attention is focused when we're thinking about scaling and when we're thinking about systems change. And another way to think about scale is when we're scaling out. And so that is generally a practice of replication, disseminating, increasing numbers of people and communities that are engaged in an activity. And so the framework around scaling deep adds a whole other layer to the concept of scaling. And intuitively, we can think about scaling deep in our work. We think about, you might think about things like how we're doing transformational change at a personal level, how we're working at a relationship level. And when we think about scaling deep, we're also talking about the cultural level of work. So this adds another layer and another kind of way in to thinking about scale that's really important. And in systems change practice, we see that the culture level of change is critical and is very important. And so this framework helps us to, the scaling deep frameworks helps us to pay attention to that particular area of work. So scaling deep involves bringing about change at cultural levels and individual levels. So when we're thinking about scaling deep, we're thinking about shifting mindsets, perceptions, cultural practices, habits, and values. So that's just to give you a sense of the framing of scaling deep. And as Barb said, there is some interesting work that's been done to help kind of think about and learn about what is scaling deep in different contexts. So when we spent time with the organizations that I mentioned that were part of this 3-year initiative, what we found is that a very important part of their strategies were operating at this scaling deep level. And they included, first of all, focusing on first voice and starting with bringing in and understanding the lived experience of the issues. So that was a key kind of strategy that the initiatives began with. And the second was strengthening relationships at the kind of core partnership and community level. So a lot of their work was spent working through relationship, through their grassroots kind of communities, through the women and the organizations that were centered in this work. And then from there, from that kind of foundation and building from lived experience, they then moved into more of a kind of scaling up activity to influence policy and practice and narratives. And so these strategies work together to create a unique systems change framework that we illustrated with this tree. We found that this was a really nice way to think about the work that happens at the root level, which represented those strategies that these organizations employed in their systems change work. So in this, you can see the centering of lived experience and the relationship building happened kind of at that root level. And then we used like the rest of the tree to kind of illustrate the different levels of work that would happen in systems change initiatives. So working across scale to influence policy, practice, and narrative, engaging new system actors, and then looking at how to leverage narrative shifts for the work. So these were the key strategies that were used across all the initiatives, and that root level was critical for their success. And I'll just say that we then, in the work that we did over the 3 years, we could then see the impacts of this. So they actually successfully had impact, and that's now, you can see that down the left of this diagram. So increased presence at decision-making tables, so increased kind of access to power and decision-making. Many played a convener role. They were actively influencing practice and policy. We could see those impacts. They were working across silos, kind of breaking out of the traditional silos, reframing other systemic issues, also bringing kind of an intersectional lens to the issues that they were working on, and unlocking new resources. So these were the systemic change impacts that we saw through the three years of their work and this initiative. And so what was really interesting about the Scaling Deep piece and the takeaway is that by scaling deep, the initiatives are shifting the power center of gravity. So they're decentering the power from like the dominant system. And this was very important because it created space to establish new norms, to experiment with other approaches, to do things differently. And this was outside of dominant cultures and systems. But without that, would they have had the same impact? Likely not. So this was that foundational work in order to then move into influencing systems. And so what we did then is we then translated these frameworks, the tree framework, into what is known as Gils transition theory. And so Rachel's going to speak to that.
Yeah, so Gils transition theory is a theory that we use very often when we're looking at systemic change initiatives to try and assess at what level in the system are they intervening. It can be used in many different ways, but I'll just outline what the different sections mean. So if you look on the left-hand side, the first image, Gils kind of says that, you know, if you want to think about creating the conditions to shift a system, it helps to work at multiple levels in the system at the same time. And the first level is what we call the landscape level. This level is all about the stories that we tell ourselves about a particular system that are often the way that it operates. So, you know, some narratives, for example, in the finance innovation lab that I used to work on, you know, were about the concept of growth is good. It's always good to grow. You know, it's an assumption that forms the foundation basis of markets and capitalist systems. Things like white supremacy sit here. They're often baked into the systems that we're surrounded by. And strategies to shift things at a landscape level are often brought to us by people who are good at telling stories. So these are the Netflix documentaries, the brilliant journalists that shift the way that we think about things. Can be something as simple as a newsletter that spreads stories about new ways and different ways of doing things that people hadn't thought about before. And there's some of the strategies we see people employing at that kind of level. Yeah, we'll definitely be sharing the slides. No problem. One step down at the regime level, this is all about the current way of operating. So this is the kind of infrastructure that forms the basis of the system. So it includes things like markets. If you're working in a market system, it can be, you know, like food, finance, energy. It will be all the big players in that system. It can be government organizations that prop up that system. And here we find ourselves with many different policies, procedures, rules, laws that have been put in place that make it difficult for that system to shift. And so strategies we see people employing here include people who are working within an existing system, forming kind of secret groups almost of rebellious groups. For example, I have some colleagues in the UK who do an organisation called the Comms Lab that's bringing together people in the advertising industry who remain in their jobs, but are questioning the industry's promotion of consumption during the climate crisis. And so they come together as a kind of fellowship group to try and push norms and think about being co-conspirators to try and change things. We also see lots of strategies like building coalitions, bringing together NGOs and think tanks to lobby government to shift some of these policies and procedures from within the system. And then finally, at the bottom, we have what we call niches of innovation. So these are innovations that spring up that represent a different way of doing things from the current system. So work here can be anything from, you see lots of strategies like incubators, accelerator programs, leadership programs to support people who are doing things in a different way based on different values. But I have a colleague again in the UK who works on trying to create change from renewable energy around shipping. And she just kept looking around, waiting for the industry to change at the regime level. And in the end, just said, right, I'm just going to have to build a ship that is powered by renewable energy, just to prove and create a demonstrator to show that another way is possible. And so often we see people doing quite ambitious projects at this level, trying to show that it is actually possible to change things and do things differently. So with the addition that Tatiana, do you want to take over on the next slide?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we came to realize is that in the learning that we had done in the strategies for systems change that the collaboratives had created at that root level was missing in this transition theory. And I think it's important to note that this transition theory is used quite a lot in systems change to kind of make sense of the system and to develop strategies for interventions at those multiple levels. So when we talk about systems practice, we think of one of the capacities for systems change is to be working at multiple levels in the system. And this helps us make sense of that, but we were missing the deep root systems. And so we took the theory and adapted it and added the deep root system at the bottom. And in this next slide, you can see what is included in the deep root systems, based on what include things like grassroots organizing. So the work that happens kind of at the community level, at the grassroots level. Movement building, so social movements, how the work that they do to build kind of the foundation for systems change work. Transformation and healing practices, which are a key part of systems change. So we talk about healing self when we're healing systems. So the deep work that we do at an individual level that is connected to the systems change, that work as well could be included here. And then we also added bringing a holistic and intersectional lens also to the ways in which that we think about the systems that we're working in and the ways in which we're kind of building an understanding of the issues and of the system. So this is the deep root system, and it's really rooted in lived experience and community. And so again, as I was saying, you can use Gils' theory. So you can see in this slide, we then see niche innovation, regime, and landscape levels moving up. And when we're looking at the transition theory, what we're looking at is the interaction between these different levels. So at the deep root system, you can see that feeds and nurtures the niche innovation. And the niche innovation level is kind of building momentum and finding alignment to break through into the systems level at the regime. And when we think about regime, just to give you an idea, it's a very much a reinforcing system, right? So it's very hard to kind of to break through. And at the landscape level, you can see the interaction between the regime level and the landscape kind of narrative cultural level are interacting together. But what was important is that we then, if we add the deep root systems, we see also then the relationship between what happens at that lived experience community level is also interacting very powerfully with the landscape level. And that leverage is huge opportunity in systems change. So this is what, this is the emerging framework that we added to from Gils' transition theory. And now we'd like to move into just having a discussion, taking the time to really hear from people how this resonates, and Barbara's going to lead us through that. So these are the questions. I'm going to drop them in the chat, but I'm going to close the screen share.
And is it possible, Tatiana, for us to see everyone or not?
I don't think so, from what I understand.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, apologies all if we can only communicate through the chat. You could try unmuting and speak. It'd be nice to have a conversation. So Tatiana and Rachel, awesome. I tried to drop and I didn't do it properly. So maybe one of you could drop in the links to the slides and to the Bridging Feminist Systems report. So folks can take that away. So first thing we'll do is move to clarifying questions. Does anyone have specific questions about the content that was presented? If not, we can just move into the discussion. You can reject. Oh, okay. Geneva's telling us if you'd like to dive in and discuss with us live, which we would love. Just request to join the meeting. Tatiana, there's two questions in the chat. One is from Patricia, who's saying, I'm wondering how funders, government, and other organizations are responding to this impact measurement.
That's a great question. How government and
funders, government, and other orgs are responding to this impact measurement.
I would say that one of the things we find is that it's when we share it, a lot of people who are in systems change work find that it kind of validates a level of work that they're intuitively already doing that isn't necessarily acknowledged. And so I would say that the scaling deep framework resonates with people, and people get excited about it and can see their work kind of reflected in it. And I would say from a funder perspective, in some of the notes that we share, I know that McConnell Foundation, who I guess I would say that in my early days of working around systems change, was part of kind of a learning community that was looking at scaling up and scaling out. And when we started to think about what is scaling deep, McConnell kind of picked that up as a framework, and they use it as a funding framework to think about systems change. So I would say there's a positive reaction, but I think there's work to do to kind of move it more into the water supply and actually leverage it as a way to think about impact and success. Because certainly culture work, the level of culture is acknowledged as important, yet I think when it actually comes down to kind of the norm or the dominant systems ways of thinking about impact, we're still in kind of the outdated mode of counting and measuring and valuing like the up and the out more than the deep. Yeah.
I would add I would agree with that from certainly an Ashoka perspective, where we're in the business of evaluating systems change. that I think there's room to really better understand, describe, recognize, validate this type of work. So it's so useful to have a framework, Tatiana and Rachel. I think that's why it resonates, because we know in our gut the hardest thing to shift is culture. And I had the question, and then I think you answered it, Tatiana, but, can this deep root systems change level lead directly to landscape change without moving, through niche and regime? And I think at the end I heard you say yes.
I think that's one of the key insights that we took away from the work with the gender equity organizations, is that it does actually interact, and that the especially in a day and age where social media is so powerful, where it decentralizes voice, like the power of voice and the power of experience. We get to hear much more from kind of diverse experiences. And so it's a huge leverage opportunity when we think about the narrative level, to be really aware of like the deep roots level, working with the landscape level together. How can we leverage the landscape level, and how can we actually influence it very strategically? And we see that in many ways. Even I think the good example is huge impact on kind of gender-based violence. Oops, am I freezing up?
Yeah. Sorry, we just missed you there, Tatiana. It sounded good. You were referring to the Me Too movement. Can you just repeat that?
Yeah, I think it's a good example, I think, of looking at the narrative level or the landscape level, and the connections that we're the interaction between the deep roots level and the individual lived experience very powerfully impacting culture and landscape. And Rachel, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this also. Did you?
Yeah, I would just say that some of the most, definitely some of the most interesting work happens at that deep root system level. And therefore, if you're somebody who is trying to commentate or talk about interesting work around social change, which is what happens at the landscape level, there is a really interesting link to be made. So what we found when we were doing the Finance Innovation Lab, for example, is people in the regime found those stories the most interesting. They wanted to hear about things that were happening at a deep root level. They didn't want to hear about like the incremental small change, happening at the regime level around policy change. We hear about those things all the time. And what's interesting and inspiring and surprising and allows for new possibility is thinking about I think there's a really clear link.
Thanks, Rachel. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Tatiana, Zainab is saying working on different levels of the system at the same time, definitely a must, but not possible to do by a single actor. Would you have any advice for platforms, collaborations, partnerships on how to work on scaling deep together? Such a good question.
I think that that's key. So Rachel and I do a lot of work with ecosystems and systems change. So collaboratives, kind of platforms that are convening to work together to shift the system. And what's important is that it is true. And often organizations are actually, to the peril, I suppose, organizations think that they have to be doing everything at every level. And that's definitely an invitation for burnout, which we also see a lot in systems change. And so when we're looking at the system, working from an ecosystem perspective with multiple diverse actors from the system, and mapping how each kind of actor is actually contributing on different levels, and seeing that whole together is very interesting. And definitely it's not one single actor who can be doing everything at all the different levels to influence that system, and understanding where you're located in the system and how your work connects to other people is really important. And that's the benefit, I think, and the importance of working at more of an ecosystem strategy level as well. Mm-hmm.
Add to that, I think using some very basic systems mapping tools, almost you could use the Gils framework, just collectively to map out who's doing what, who's influencing what, who's working in different ways and different interventions collectively, can create a space for you to find places where you could work together to do things that you couldn't do on your own. But also just to show the power of everybody playing the different roles that they're playing in a system, so that everybody has a sense of validation that, yeah, we're a movement working together towards a common goal. We don't need to step on each other's toes. But also just to say it's relationships, isn't it? It's deep relationships. It's slow, painstaking, checking yourself, basic stuff around like building, cultivating, deepening, nurturing relationships, which is crucial.
And so why do you guys think we haven't had broad acceptance of this? I mean, it makes so much sense, and we know this is true. And there's evidence around elements of strategy. I'm thinking of and culture, culture eats strategy for lunch or whatever that article was, or breakfast. But recognition of the hard work of actually shifting culture, I think, can fall into the soft stuff. Or, why aren't we like hearing about this everywhere? What are some of the barriers?
That's such a great question, Barb. Thank you. And I think that kind of speaks to the need for something like a WISER initiative, because the assumptions around systems change, or the assumptions around change, are often rooted in kind of the outdated ways of seeing and being in the world. And so we might, assume, for example, that, endless growth, like the S curve of business, is success, right? Growing and growing and working at kind of the very strategic policy levels is success. And those assumptions are rooted in a culture that is still kind of steeped in outdated ways of thinking that are about hierarchy, are about kind of rational ways of getting to change that actually work in very kind of linear ways, or think about, like, don't see the interconnectivity necessarily. It kind of work in what we call clockware, which is like rooted in kind of mechanistic thinking. Like if we move this and this, and we twinkle these pieces of the system, we can achieve systems change. And so working at a culture level is actually a mindset shift, which is, includes things like seeing yourself in the system, and the deep learning and deep reflection on our unconscious bias on who we are in the system. It kind of challenges kind of the traditional assumptions on expertise, and like that knowledge is something that comes from experts or academia. We recenter in this new mindset. We recenter kind of lived experience and human experience. And we also value like relationship and the work of the relationships and the systems change. So it's shifting. It actually is shifting from kind of outdated ways. And we actually think, the thing about WISER is that it's discovered that women systems leaders are more intuitively working in this way, but it's not necessarily recognized or valued. So that's gendered also in lots of ways. Women are leading and lead intuitively in this way. Some women do, not all women. But it's a different way of thinking about success. Success isn't getting to the top and being the winner and like, moving things by kind of hierarchy and power in that way. It's a new way of understanding power, which is much more distributed and interconnected. And this aligns with kind of feminist ways of working, which are gendered, and also the feminine, if we just think about feminine and kind of masculine ways of being in the world. So there's lots of shifts to actually value this and to practice in this way.
Mm-hmm. And I think that the elephant in the room might be that, you know, shifting power involves giving up of power. And I'm thinking about the fact that you both are co-founders multiple times over, co-authors, as you said, the inherent way of sharing leadership. And I think this is something all of us from our own point in the system start to really, create room for and celebrate and hold up different ways of working. Yes, and Rachel's here talking about working at the speed of trust. Of course, we know this is so true. Maybe we could, oh, and I see Sanjana. So glad to have you here, Sanjana. A question. I'm wondering how some of these insights translate to practical interventions. Something I'm seeing is intermediaries prepare the ground for culture and values work. Okay, these entities almost pick up best practice from the field and work with partners to help it infiltrate. Their legitimacy of intermediaries is also assessed using the benchmark of scale. So yeah, more about complexities and levels. Any responses to that comment from Sanjana?
Well, I mean, I'll just quickly say that, you know, that scaling deep section is, as Tatiana said, a lot about first voice. And so it's sometimes, you know, it's often not helpful to pay a consultant to extract knowledge from a community where the community could be empowered to create the solutions themselves. So that would be something that we definitely advocate, Tatiana.
Yeah, and I think this is where, in social innovation, we talk about the innovative ideas are at the margins, right? This is where innovation lives. And I think there is a trend towards ecosystem initiatives that are often led by institutions, whether it's funders or intermediaries that are actually located in the dominant systems. And so when that happens, I think that what we need to do is be really careful that those ecosystem initiatives or collaboratives or intermediaries aren't recreating the systems that they're trying to shift. And so by decentering, I think that's the thing about scaling deep. And what we've learned is we decenter the power and recenter it more in the margins, kind of traditionally, or more. And that shifts the gravity of power, the center of gravity. And so ecosystem initiatives, I think, led by, communities outside of dominant systems, and definitely informing and really critically being a part of those ecosystem initiatives is really important. And being very conscious that intermediaries are not just kind of rooted in dominant power systems and then maybe blind to other ways of being and knowing and seeing, or perspectives or visions about what change could be. So that's the risk, I think, in terms of designing with the ecosystem and intermediaries.
We have 1 minute to go, ladies. Why don't we, first of all, thank you both for your work on this in the System Sanctuary. Find this resource, folks, if you haven't used it, because this is a place of learning and support and rejuvenation. I think it's a refuge for systems leaders. So look that up, and then you can contact Rachel and Tatiana through that. But this is critically important work. So let's close with an ask of participants. Tatiana and Rachel, what's one thing that you would like people to walk away and do following this time together?
I would like people to, if they see themselves in this framework, to feel more confident and feel validated in the work that you're doing, if it's at the deep root level, and know that it is making a hugely significant contribution to systems change, and find others who have the same view of you, because it would be really cool if we were able to speak more loudly about the need for this recognition.
Nice, Rachel. Thank you. Tatiana.
Yeah, I think the invitation for just reflection also on a personal level, in terms of how we think about ourselves and how we're located in the system, and the scaling deep work that we do in our as part of our kind of reflective practice, to be really courageous about that. And because I think part of this work is connecting to the human experience, the full human experience, and that's part of this journey as well. And it's an invitation into healing and into humility, and lifelong learning as well. So yeah, that's the invitation.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I have an ask also from inside Ashoka. I would say, if you know of systems shifters who are working in this way, please nominate them as Ashoka Fellow candidates. If you work inside the system of Ashoka, please help us ensure that candidates whose work is happening in this way are supported, and you could potentially use this framework. We all need to get better at describing this in order for it to be well understood. And all of us, let's remember how important this is. We're at the beginning, I think, of a big time shift in understanding here. We're on the front end of it. So be brave, call it out when you see it, support it when you can. I just dropped a link to our partners page for Ashoka Canada, where we're doing something called the Foundation Academy for Radical Collaboration, which is now moving into initiatives which are around shifting at the level of culture and mindset. So connect with us there if you'd like. Thank you, everyone. So nice to be with you today, and congratulations, Tatiana, Rachel, and others who've explored this work. It's critically important.
Thanks, Barb. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure. Bye-bye.